The bathroom mirror reflected a stranger as I adjusted my hair, my reflection meeting Todd's steady gaze from his office window next door. The front door slammed below, jarring me. Mike was home hours early, his confused call, then silence. I reached for my robe, but it was too late. He stood there, eyes holding not anger, but a crushing recognition of who I'd become. "Go ahead," he said, his voice flat. "Don't let me stop you." The morning light, thin and pale, always found its way through the bathroom window, painting a cool stripe across the polished tile. I had paused there, drying my hair, the towel loose around me. It was a habit I'd picked up over the last few weeks, this moment of lingering by the gracious, feeling the cool air on my skin. Across the perfectly manicured lawn, in the second-story office of the house next door, Todd Peterson would be at his desk, a writer I'd heard, though I never saw him write. Only watched. His gaze was a silent hum, a low current beneath the surface of the quiet morning. I knew he was there, a shadow in the frame, and a subtle thrill, faint but persistent, would ripple through me. Then the front door slammed downstairs. It wasn't a gentle close. It was a solid, undeniable thud that vibrated through the floorboards. Mike. He was home. Hours early. My stomach tightened, a cold knot forming instantly. He was supposed to be at the regional meeting in Davenport until at least 5. "Laura?" His voice, a little confused, drifted up the stairwell. Silence followed. The sound of his heavy work boots on the carpeted stairs began, slow and deliberate. Panic, sharp and sudden, clawed at my throat. I fumbled for my terry cloth robe, draped over the vanity chair. My fingers tangled in the fabric. It was too late. Mike stood in the doorway, blocking the last of the light from the hall. He wasn't yelling, wasn't red-faced with anger. His expression was far worse. His eyes, usually clouded with the calculations of his financial world, were clear, almost painfully so. They held a crushing recognition, a quiet acknowledgement of something irretrievable. He looked at me, then past me, toward the window, then back. He simply saw who I'd become, laid bare. Our marriage had been built on a foundation of quiet dependability. 8 years. Mike, a financial analyst, had promised stability, and he'd delivered. A house in the suburbs, 2 cars, a predictable rhythm of weekends and holidays. He was a good provider, meticulous with spreadsheets, always 2 steps ahead on the mortgage. But passion, if it had ever truly existed, had long since faded into the background hum of routine. Conversations often ended with him scrolling through emails on his phone, his thumb a blur against the screen, his attention somewhere else entirely. I'd tried, in my own quiet ways, to shift the current. A new haircut, shorter, more stylish, that spring. Brighter colors in my wardrobe, shedding the muted tones I'd worn for years. But Mike never seemed to notice. "Looks fine, honey," he'd say, without lifting his gaze from the evening news or his tablet. It was less a dismissal and more a complete lack of observation, as if I were a piece of furniture he'd grown accustomed to. The arrival of the Peterson brothers next door had been a jolt to the neighborhood's quiet complacency. Frank, the elder, an architectural restorer, had an intense, focused energy, always seeming to evaluate the structural integrity of the world around him. Todd, the younger, a writer, possessed a charming, almost languid flirtatiousness that felt like a breath of fresh air. I baked a batch of oatmeal raisin cookies, the universal welcome gesture in our town, and carried them over one Saturday afternoon. Todd had answered the door, a half smile playing on his lips. "Well, look at this," he'd said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "A goddess bearing gifts." I'd laughed, a light, genuine sound that surprised even myself, despite the silver band on my left hand. Frank, appearing from the kitchen, had been more direct. "You should join us for dinner sometime," he'd offered, once we're settled. A lightness, foreign and unexpected, had bloomed in my chest, a new energy. It began subtly. I started timing my morning runs to coincide with Frank's departure for work. A quick, "Good morning, neighbor," exchanged across the dewy grass. Todd, meanwhile, cultivated his own silent ritual. From his office window, I'd catch him. A glance, a slow raise of his coffee mug, and a silent toast. It was an unspoken acknowledgement, a thread drawn taut between our houses. I mentioned the Petersons to Mike a few evenings later, casually, over a dinner of baked chicken and roasted vegetables. They seem nice, I said. Frank even suggested dinner. Mike was deep in a pile of financial documents spread across the kitchen table, his brow furrowed. Hmm? He'd grunted, not looking up. Oh, that's nice. Just tell them we're busy. His indifference was a cold stone settling in my gut. Something hardened inside me. Maybe I'll just go by myself, I heard myself say, the words sharper than I intended, since you're so busy. He finally looked up, his expression blank. He shrugged, a small dismissive gesture. You're an adult, Laura. You don't need my permission. I held my phone in my hand, the screen glowing faintly in the dim living room. The text message to Frank was short, just a confirmation. Mike's tied up. I'll come alone if that's still okay. I pressed send, a slight tremor in my fingers. The reply came almost instantly, a speed that startled me. Just you as always welcome, Laura. Looking forward to it. A warmth spread through my chest, a quick, surprising thrill. It was a simple message, but it felt like an invitation to something more than just dinner. Todd opened the door before I even knocked, a pretty easy smile on his face. He executed a dramatic bow, a flourish that was entirely his own. Ah, the queen arrives, unburdened by her workaholic king. He winked. Good thing some of us appreciate the finer things. The light-hearted jab at Mike, though a little too close to the truth, made me laugh. A free, uninhibited sound. The evening unfolded with an ease I hadn't felt in years, perhaps since before I'd married. Frank, meticulous in the kitchen, moved with a quiet efficiency, producing a spectacular meal of roasted lamb with rosemary and garlic, alongside fresh asparagus. Cooking is my stress relief, he explained, without looking up from carving the meat. The only time my mind fully quiets. Todd, meanwhile, kept the conversation light, weaving stories about his writing projects and past travels, making us both laugh with his self-deprecating humor. The wine flowed, easing the edges of my usual reserve. I found myself talking, truly talking, about my corporate job, the endless stream of events I organized for clients, the predictable spreadsheets and budgets. Then, almost without thinking, I confessed a secret dream, a quiet ambition I rarely spoke aloud. Owning my own event space, a place with character, maybe an old renovated barn. Frank paused, a piece of lamb on his fork. He looked at me, his gaze steady. You should do it, Laura, he said, his voice firm, unwavering. Todd leaned forward, a spark in his eyes. Absolutely. Our Laura is wasted on corporate events. You have a vision. You should chase it. The phrase, our Laura, lingered in the air. Possessive, yes, but not unwelcome. It was a soft, warm blanket wrapped around a part of me that had felt cold and ignored. Mike hadn't expressed belief in any of my dreams for years, not truly. He'd offer practical advice, sure, or ask about the financials, but never that genuine, unreserved encouragement. Later, after dessert, we moved to the back deck. The night air was cool, smelling of damp earth and late-blooming jasmine. Todd leaned against the railing, a half-empty glass in his hand, his voice dropping slightly. So, he began, looking directly at me, what's the real story with you and the absent husband? I felt exposed, caught under the soft glow of the string lights, but also, strangely, seen. It's not, I started, then trailed off, searching for the right words. We're just in a rut, I guess. It happens in long-term relationships. I knew it sounded like a cliché, a convenient excuse, but it was the closest I could come to the truth without unraveling completely. Frank returned from inside, carrying a fresh bottle of wine. He sensed the shift in the conversation, the sudden intimacy. Everything all right out here? He asked, his eyes moving between us. Then with a playful glance at Todd, he added, if he's being inappropriate, I'll throw him over the fence for you. The absurdity of it made me laugh, a genuine burst of amusement that broke the tension. But the moment had passed. Both brothers, I realized, saw the cracks in my carefully constructed facade, the quiet loneliness I carried beneath the surface. They saw it in the way I spoke, in the way I'd sought their company. It was close to 11 when I finally stood to leave, a pleasant buzz of wine and conversation warming me. Frank walked me to the edge of his property, to the invisible line that separated our yards. I had a really good time tonight, Laura. he said, his voice softer now, almost a murmur. Me too, I replied, meaning it deeply. More than I thought possible. Then on impulse, the words tumbled out. You know you're a really good cook. Maybe you could teach me sometime. A slight smile touched his lips. I remember you mentioning you wanted to expand your skills, anytime. He remembered that small, throwaway comment from weeks ago, a detail Mike would have forgotten the moment it left my lips. Back in my own quiet, dark house, the air felt cold after the warmth of the Petersons' home. I moved through the familiar rooms, the only sound the soft hum of the refrigerator. I stopped at the bedroom doorway, looking at Mike, a dark shape under the quilt, his breathing even and deep. The first conscious acknowledgement, clear and stark, settled over me like a shroud. I was falling for another man. The weeks that followed were marked by Mike's increasing absence. His job, he explained, was demanding more, requiring longer hours at the office, occasional overnight trips. The house felt emptier, the silence stretching, vast and cold. I found myself inventing reasons to go next door. A question about local gardening, borrowing a tool, a new batch of cookies. Each excuse felt flimsy, yet compelling. Todd's flirtation grew bolder, more pronounced. He'd greet me at the door with a theatrical flourish, a new compliment each time. Laura, you radiate today, like the first bloom of spring. Or, my muse has arrived and the coffee is on. His words, while over the time, still managed to chip away at the quiet wall I'd built around myself. Frank, meanwhile, was different. His attention was subtle, a quiet understanding in his gaze that seemed to acknowledge a shared language, unspoken. He listened intently, his presence a balm. The cooking lessons began as planned, a deliberate weekly ritual. Our first dish was a complex coq au vin. I learned to chop vegetables with precision, to deglaze a pan, to understand the subtle alchemy of flavors. The kitchen, with its warm light and the rich aromas of simmering food, became a sanctuary. Our conversations strayed from recipes, moving to deeper, more personal matters. We talked about our lives, our frustrations, our quiet hopes. I found myself sharing things with Frank that I hadn't articulated in years, not even to myself. One afternoon, as we were reaching for the same bag of fresh thyme, Frank's hand accidentally brushed mine. The contact was brief, a fleeting warmth against my skin, but it sent a sharp jolt through me, a ripple that traveled up my arm and settled insistent in my chest. I pulled my hand back quickly, my breath catching. It was just an accident, I told myself, just a moment of awkward proximity. We were just friends, learning to cook. That was all it was, but the lingering gazes, the way his eyes seemed to hold mine a fraction of a second too long, the quiet intensity when we talked, it all told a different story, one I was trying hard to ignore. Todd's presence was a constant, a knowing observer. He'd often wander into the kitchen during our lessons, a coffee mug in hand, offering witty remarks or a playful poke. His knowing smiles, the way his eyes tracked me, made me feel scrutinized, yet also undeniably desired. It was a strange duality, this feeling of being both exposed and cherished. I felt more alive than I had in years, a buzzing exhilaration that coursed through my veins, pushing away the dull ache of my stagnant life. But beneath the surface, a growing guilt twisted itself into a tight knot. It was a faint whisper at first, then a low thrum that accompanied me everywhere. At home, the disconnect from Mike became more pronounced. His obliviousness was almost a relief, a shield against confrontation, yet it also felt like a heavy burden. I would return from the Petersons' house, my mind buzzing with conversation and laughter, to find Mike absorbed in his work, the only sound the click of his keyboard. "How was your day, honey?" he'd ask without looking up, a rhetorical question. My elaborate stories about what Frank and Todd had discussed, the ideas we'd exchanged, the dreams I'd rediscovered, remained unspoken. They were details I knew he wouldn't truly hear. One evening after a particularly late departure, the moon, high and full, Frank walked me to the property line, as he often did. The air was cool and crisp. We stood there for a moment, the silence comfortable. Then he turned and, without a word, pulled me into a hug. It was meant as a goodbye, a friendly gesture, but he held me a little too long, his arms firm around my waist, pulling me close. My head rested against his shoulder, and I could feel the solid warmth of him, the faint scent of spices, and something uniquely Frank. In his embrace, a profound sense of longing washed over me, a yearning for something I hadn't realized I was missing. It was a sense of belonging, a feeling of being completely present and utterly seen. The careful lines of my self-deception blurred, then dissolved entirely. This was not just friendship. This was something far more potent, far more dangerous. I pulled back, my cheeks flushed, my heart thrumming. "Good night, Frank," I whispered, my voice a little unsteady. I told myself it was just friendship, a much-needed emotional connection, a lifeline in a quiet life. But as I walked across my dark lawn, the thought rang hollow, echoing the emptiness inside me. The scent of simmering broth filled the Peterson kitchen during our next cooking lesson. We were making French onion soup, the caramelizing onions turning a deep, rich brown in the pan. The conversation, as it often did, had drifted away from the recipe, landing on childhood memories and unspoken regrets. There was a pause, a comfortable silence that stretched, filled only by the gentle hiss of the stove. Frank turned from the counter, his gaze locking with mine. He leaned in slowly, deliberately. The kiss was intense, immediate, consuming. It wasn't gentle or tentative. It was a dam breaking, a release of weeks of unspoken tension and desire. My hands found his shoulders, pulling him closer, and I reciprocated fully, every ounce of longing and frustration pouring into the moment. Time seemed to stop, suspended in the warmth of his mouth, the scent of him, the sheer undeniable fact of it. Immediately after, a cold wave of regret washed over me, sharp and stinging. What had I done? But it was quickly, powerfully overshadowed by something else, a potent, urgent desire that thrummed through my veins. The guilt was there, a dull ache, but the passion was a roaring fire. The affair quickly became physical, a secret life meticulously carved out of my days. Lunchtime rendezvous when Mike was at the office, evenings when he worked late, moments snatched between grocery runs and dry cleaning pickups. Each stolen hour was a dangerous exhilaration, a world away from the quiet monotony of my home. I grappled with profound guilt, a constant companion that whispered at the edges of my thoughts. But then I'd compare it to the stale familiarity of my marriage to Mike, the predictable rhythm, the emotional distance, and the contrast was stark. This with Frank was vibrant, a lefeve, a raw passion that had been absent for years. It was easy to rationalize it as a necessary escape, a reclaiming of myself. Frank, in those stolen moments, expressed a deep emotional connection. "You've become my anchor, Laura," he told me once, his fingers tracing the line of my jaw. "The one thing that feels truly solid." His words made me feel cherished, seen in a way Mike hadn't managed in years. Our stolen moments were carefully planned, each text, each glance, a part of a larger, secret choreography. The thrill of transgression, the risk of discovery, became a potent aphrodisiac. I felt profoundly understood by Frank. He listened to my frustrations, celebrated my small victories, and seemed to grasp the unspoken nuances of my thoughts without me having to explain. It was a stark contrast to Mike's polite but distant nods, his attention always fractured by work. Todd's growing awareness of our affair was becoming increasingly evident. His subtle comments, the way his eyes would track me when I left Frank's side, the knowing smiles he'd offer, they made me increasingly uncomfortable. It felt like I was living under a microscope, performing a dangerous dance, with Todd as the silent, observant audience. His complicity, though unspoken, was a heavy weight. Mike, meanwhile, remained oblivious. Absorbed in his work, his world seemed to shrink to the confines of his office and his financial reports. This obliviousness fueled both my frustration, why couldn't he see what was happening to us, and my underlying guilt. His blindness felt like both a blessing and a curse. I found myself in a constant internal debate. Was this true love, this intense connection with Frank, or merely an escape from my suffocating reality? Was I truly falling for him, or for the idea of a life that felt vibrant and full? Frank, deeply invested, began to push for more. I would leave everything for you, Laura, he said one quiet afternoon, his voice earnest. We could start over. Just us. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken pressure. The thought of destroying my life, and Mike's, of shattering the carefully constructed stability of our existence, filled me with a cold dread. It was one thing to escape into a secret world. It was another to blow up the world I already inhabited. I began to see how deeply entangled I was, not just with Frank, but also with Todd's silent, knowing complicity. He was a constant reminder, an unwelcome witness. The affair, once an exhilarating escape, began to feel like a trap. Its initial thrill was slowly, subtly being replaced by a growing anxiety, a constant fear of discovery that tightened its grip with each passing day. One Tuesday evening, Mike surprised me. He looked up from his financial papers, not with his usual distant gaze, but with a tentative smile. Laura, my mom, he said, I was thinking, how about a weekend getaway? Just us. Maybe up to Lake Geneva. A real chance to reconnect. A flicker of hope ignited within me, fragile and unexpected. My old life, the one before the Petersons, seemed to beckon, a distant memory of simplicity and safety. For a moment, the affair, Frank, Todd, they all receded, replaced by the ghost of what Mike and I once had. I stood there, on the precipice of honesty, the words of confession forming on my tongue. The fear of shattering everything, combined with the deeply ingrained habit of silence, held them back. I hesitated, then swallowed. The chance, however small, to mend things, to claw back some semblance of normalcy, was appealing. But the pull of Frank, the raw intensity of our connection, was too strong. I rationalized it, telling myself Mike's years of neglect, his emotional absence, had led me here. He had created the void and someone else had merely filled it. I decided to continue the affair. The getaway to Lake Geneva was cloaked in a heavy, suffocating silence. Mike, unaware of the burden I carried, made genuine efforts. He held my hand during walks along the shore, suggested quaint little restaurants, listened more intently when I spoke. Each gesture, each small attempt at rekindling, only amplified my guilt and a creeping self-loathing. I found myself maintaining an emotional distance, a wall between us. My mind drifted constantly to Frank, to the memory of his touch, the intensity of his gaze. The picturesque scenery, the calm lake, all felt muted, unreal. The moment we pulled into our driveway, the suburban quiet of our street settling around us, I felt an urgent need to escape. The guilt from the weekend was a physical weight, pressing down on me. I waited until Mike was inside, then almost instinctively found myself walking across the lawn to the Petersons' house. I needed Frank. I needed to wash away the lingering presence of my husband. Frank, sensing the renewed pressure from Mike's attempts, was direct. He pulled me into the kitchen, his voice low. Laura, he said, his eyes intense. This can't go on like this. You have to make a choice, him or me. The demand, while expected, still hit me with the force of a punch. Todd, it seemed, also felt the shift in dynamics. His veiled threats and manipulative comments became more frequent, almost a daily occurrence. Your husband seems to be spending more time at home, doesn't he? He'd say with a knowing smirk, or wouldn't want anyone to misunderstand our little family dinners, would we? I felt caught, squeezed between the two brothers, Frank demanding a decision, Todd lurking, watching, a silent judge. The initial liberation I'd felt, the exhilarating freedom of the affair, had completely evaporated. It was replaced by a pervasive sense of dread. I felt trapped, suffocating under the weight of my deceit. My anxiety and paranoia spiked. I constantly worried about being discovered, checking my phone for messages, looking over my shoulder when I walked outside. Every unexpected sound, every unfamiliar car on the street sent a jolt of fear through me. The affair, once a thrilling escape, had become a source of immense stress. The joy, the passion, had dissolved into a bitter cocktail of fear and moral decay. One quiet afternoon, sitting alone in my living room, the sunlight slanting across the dust motes, dancing in the air, a brief moment of clarity pierced through my denial. I saw it all, stark and ugly. The carefully constructed lies, the unraveling of my life, the innocent people I was hurting. What have I done? I whispered to myself, the words barely audible. The weight of my deceit, the full crushing impact of my choices, pressed down on me, threatening to suffocate me entirely. This messy path, once so alluring, was now a tangled web of my own making. Stick around to the end to see how life's costly choices unfold. Todd's demands for my attention had become bolder, less veiled. He'd often appear in the kitchen during a cooking lesson with Frank, lingering, making pointed comments. Funny, he'd say, leaning against the counter, eyes on me. How some people miss what's happening right shown under their noses. But I don't. I see things. His gaze would drop to my hand, resting near Frank's on the countertop, and then flick back to my eyes. The casualness of his tone was a thin disguise for the steel beneath it. He was no longer just observant. He was actively playing a dangerous game, manipulating the edges of my secret. I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. The next time Frank and I were alone, the scent of simmering tomato sauce filling the air, I brought it up. "Frank," I started, my voice lower than usual, "we need to talk about Todd." He paused, stirring the sauce, then looked at me, a slight frown on his face. "What about him? He's a bit much, I know, but he means well." "No," I insisted, shaking my head. "It's more than that. He's making comments, pointed ones. He explicitly mentioned seeing things. He's not just jealous, Frank. He's trying to control this." Frank scoffed, a quick, dismissive sound. "Sibling rivalry. He's always been a bit theatrical. He'll get over it." "You don't understand," I pressed, my voice gaining an edge. "It's darker than that, more calculated. He's not just teasing, he's threatening." The words hung in the air, cold and stark. The realization settled in. I had to cut ties with Todd. His presence was a growing threat, a ticking clock that could detonate my carefully constructed secret at any moment. The next day, I approached him when he was alone in the front yard, pruning roses. "Todd," I began, my voice attempting a polite formality I didn't feel. I think maybe we need a little space." I tried to frame it as something for my own peace of mind, a way to reduce neighborhood gossip. Just a bit of distance, you know? Things are getting a little complicated. His pruning shears snapped shut with a sharp click. He turned, his face hardening, the playful charm entirely gone. "Complicated?" he repeated, his voice dangerously low. "You mean Frank and your little kitchen rendezvous? Or are you talking about your husband who still thinks you're making him oatmeal raisin cookies?" He stepped closer, his eyes narrowed. "You think you can just drop me? Like I'm some inconvenient piece of luggage? You think your husband's so blind he won't believe me when I tell him exactly what I've seen? Who you've become." A cold dread seeped into my bones, paralyzing me. Panic seized my throat. His words were not veiled any longer. They were explicit, direct, a threat hurled like a stone. He meant it. He would do it. The full extent of Todd's vindictive nature hit me with sickening force. I left him there, the scent of cut roses suddenly acrid in my nostrils, and practically ran back to Frank's house. He was in the living room, sketching architectural details. "He threatened me," I gasped, the words tumbling out, ragged and breathless. "Todd, he said he would tell Mike. He knows everything." Frank's face, usually so calm and composed, contorted with a raw, furious anger. His jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists. "He what?" he practically roared, pushing himself up from the sofa. "That manipulative son of a bitch." He threw his sketchbook onto the coffee table with a thud. "I'll kill him. I swear to God, I will." He stormed out of the house, heading towards their shared front yard. I stood by the kitchen window, trembling, listening. The Peterson brothers' voices, muffled but heated, carried across the short distance between our homes. Frank's deep tones, then Todd's sharper, higher pitch, arguing, yelling, the sounds rising and falling like a tempest. My affair. It wasn't just my secret anymore. It had shattered their family too, a ripple effect I hadn't fully considered. The walls were closing in, the comfortable illusion of my secret world crumbling into dust. The affair, which had promised escape and freedom, had become a suffocating prison. Todd held the key, and he was rattling it, threatening to unlock the cell and expose me to the world. I spent restless nights staring at the ceiling, picturing the inevitable fallout. Mike's face, etched with betrayal, the quiet whispers of the neighbors, the destruction of everything I knew. Fear and regret consumed me, twisting my stomach into knots. I knew I had to act, to do something, anything, but every option that flickered through my mind seemed fraught with catastrophe, leading only to more pain, more chaos. The heated argument between Frank and Todd had settled into a simmering tension that permeated the neighborhood. It was clear that Todd wouldn't back down, and Frank was at a loss. The air grew thick with unspoken threats, and I knew I couldn't let Todd be the one to tell Mike. I had to retain some fragment of dignity, some small measure of control. The only way was to tell Mike myself. I spent hours, days even, meticulously planning how to break the news. I rehearsed the words in my head, arranging them carefully, trying to find a balance between honesty and gentleness. There was no gentle way, I knew, but I had to try. I braced myself for his anger, for the searing pain I knew I would inflict, for the inevitable questions that would follow, questions I didn't have clean answers for. I prepared for the end of my marriage, a slow, painful amputation. The story returns to that morning. I was in the bathroom, having just stepped out of the shower. The cool air from the open window felt good on my skin. I stood there, naked, deliberately stretching, pretending to reach for the lotion on the shelf, my body angled just so. I knew Todd was watching. From his office across the narrow strip of lawn, his gaze was a familiar weight, a final defiant act of transgression. This was my last desperate attempt to feel something, anything, before I shattered my own life. Then the front door slammed, a heavy, jarring sound that echoed through the quiet house. Mike. He was home, hours early. "Laura?" His voice, a little confused, drifted up the stairwell. The confusion turned to silence, a heavy, ominous quiet that stretched, making the small hairs on my arms stand up. The deliberate pace of his work boots on the carpeted stairs began, slow and methodical. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at my throat. I fumbled for my terry cloth robe, draped over the vanity chair, my fingers tangled in the fabric. It was too late. Mike stood in the doorway, blocking the last of the morning light. He wasn't yelling, wasn't red-faced with anger. His expression was far worse. His eyes, usually clouded with the calculations of his financial world, were clear, painfully so. They held a crushing recognition, a quiet acknowledgement of something irretrievable. He looked at me, then past me, toward the window, then back. He didn't need words. He simply saw who I'd become, laid bare, stripped of all pretending. In that moment, I knew he finally understood. I had destroyed everything. He didn't yell. He didn't demand an explanation. Instead, he simply walked to the dresser, his movements calm, almost detached. My phone, lying face down, was a glowing rectangle in his hand a moment later. He scrolled through it, his thumb a blur against the screen, his face unreadable. I knew what he was looking for, knew what he would find. The incriminating text messages from Frank. The quiet confirmations, the intimate thoughts, the undeniable proof of my betrayal. Without a word, Mike turned and walked out of the bedroom. His silence was more devastating than any shout, more crushing than any accusation. It was the sound of a profound, irrevocable break. "Mike!" I cried, grabbing my robe, pulling it tight around me. I followed him downstairs, desperate, my voice hollow and useless, trying to explain, to justify, to salvage some fragment of our life. "Mike, please, let me explain. It's not what you think, not entirely. It's just..." He didn't stop. He walked through the living room, past the carefully arranged furniture, past the framed photographs of our wedding, our shared memories. He reached the front door, opened it, and walked out into the bright morning. The door closed softly behind him, leaving a profound, echoing silence in its wake. I stood alone in the hallway, the cool air settling around me, the soft click of the closing door a final punctuation mark. My world, once a carefully maintained balance, was crumbling, shattered by my own hand. The full crushing consequences of my choices came crashing down, leaving me breathless and utterly alone. The immediate aftermath was a deafening silence. Frank didn't answer my calls. Days passed, then a week. Each ring, each unanswered tone echoed the growing chasm within me. The abandonment was swift and brutal. Then a letter arrived. His handwriting, once so familiar, now felt alien on the crisp white paper. It was filled with regret, not for me, but for his own precarious situation, his career, his reputation. A carefully worded dismissal, devoid of warmth or responsibility. His fear for his future eclipsed any concern for mine. Todd, however, was not silent. His harassment escalated. Text messages arrived at all hours, vindictive and mocking. "Hope Mike enjoyed the show," one read. "Karma's a bitch, isn't she?" His phone calls, though I never answered, were constant, the vibration of my phone a persistent reminder of his cruel satisfaction. The weight of it all, the guilt, the shame, the sudden, complete collapse of my life, was too much. I felt myself slipping, a fragile thread unraveling. There were days I couldn't get out of bed, the curtains drawn, the darkness a welcome oblivion. A full-blown mental breakdown, I suppose. The world narrowed to the four walls of my bedroom. Mike refused to speak to me directly. All communication came through his lawyer, a cold, formal exchange of documents and demands. The separation was not just physical, but legal, sterile, and entirely devoid of the emotional wreckage I felt. The financial repercussions were swift and sharp. Joint bank accounts were frozen, credit cards canceled. I was left in a precarious position, the practical realities of my former life suddenly stripped away. My performance at work, once a source of quiet pride, deteriorated rapidly. Missed deadlines, blank stares during meetings, the inability to focus on even the simplest tasks. It wasn't long before a cold, formal email landed in my inbox. My corporate events job was terminated. They cited performance issues, but I knew. Everyone knew. My mother, bless her pragmatic heart, offered what she called tough love. She came over, surveying the mess of my life with a stern gaze. "You made your bed, Laura," she'd said, her voice flat, devoid of any sympathy. "You're still young. You need a reliable man. You need to get yourself together. This isn't how we do things." She offered advice on budgeting, on finding a new job, on navigating the legal system. Not once did she ask how I felt, or offer a word of comfort for the choices I'd made. The house, once a comforting symbol of my stable, suburban life, became a suffocating prison. It was filled with Mike's absence, yes, but more acutely, with my own failures. Every corner, every object, was a reminder of what I had lost, what I had carelessly thrown away. The divorce proceedings began, a grim dance of legal jargon and impersonal negotiations. Forms to fill out, assets to divide, custody agreements. For a life that was now utterly broken, there was no emotional connection, no space for the raw pain of betrayal, only the cold, hard facts of the law. I grappled with the full weight of my choices, the profound impact on every single aspect of my existence. My marriage, my home, my job, my reputation, my relationships, all shattered. I picked up my phone one last time, my fingers hovering over Frank's number. I pressed dial, but the line went straight to voicemail, just as it had for weeks. His complete withdrawal was absolute. The realization settled in, heavy and crushing. I was truly, utterly alone. I had alienated everyone I once held dear, driven them away with my deceit and selfishness. Then, as suddenly and silently as they had arrived, the Peterson brothers were gone. One morning, the for sale sign appeared in their yard. Within a week, the house was empty, cleared out, no trace of them left behind. Just the quiet, neat house next door, vacant once more. They had simply vanished, leaving me in the wreckage. I was left sifting through the pieces of what was once my life, a solitary figure in a landscape of my own making. The divorce was finalized in a bitter, swift process that left me stripped bare, legally and emotionally. I sold the house, the dream home Mike and I had built, letting go of not just a property, but a future. I moved into a small, nondescript apartment, a stark contrast to the life I'd known, signaling a humbler, solitary beginning. I found a less glamorous job, working purely for survival, rebuilding from ash. The emotional scars lingered, a constant, dull ache, a reminder of every choice. I no longer blamed Mike. The responsibility was entirely mine. Painful lessons had been learned about self-worth, the true meaning of connection, and the fleeting, destructive nature of illicit thrills. Loneliness was a frequent visitor, especially during quiet evenings. There was no grand redemption, no sudden burst of hope. Instead, a quiet, somber acceptance settled over me, a life of self-imposed penance. I carried the lingering sense of loss for what could have been, the life I carelessly cast aside. Some betrayals, I understood now, could never truly be undone. My future was uncertain, but built on hard-won honesty. I watched the unchanging Midwestern landscape, a mirror to my own internal stillness. I was alone, but with a clearer, albeit somber, understanding of myself and the consequences of my choices. The quiet of the empty house next door echoed the stillness in my own life. The for sale sign stood for weeks, then disappeared. The Mitchell brothers, once so present, were simply gone, leaving no forwarding address, no trace, just another vacant house in a long line of them. The divorce, when it finally arrived, was a cold, efficient document. No anger, no tears from Mike, just the finality of signatures and legal jargon. I signed away the house, the dream, the stability, all of it. I moved to a smaller place, a rental apartment in a different part of town, nondescript and functional. My new job was less about ambition and more about keeping the lights on. It was a life stripped bare, focused solely on the mechanics of survival. The scars of the affair, of Todd's vindictiveness, of Frank's abandonment, were not visible, but they were there, woven into the fabric of my days. There was no grand epiphany, no dramatic moment of rebirth. Just a slow, somber acceptance of the consequences. I looked at the quiet Midwestern landscape, flat and unchanging, much like the new terrain of my life. It was a life I had carved out of wreckage, devoid of the old excitements and the old illusions. I was alone, yeah, but for the first time in a long time, I was also honest.